What does it take to break a monster? Not a blade, not an army, but a single, intoxicating scent. Imagine a creature so powerful, so dominant, that fear is its shadow. Now imagine that same creature, brought to its knees not by an enemy, but by love. In tonight's audiobook, we're diving into the untold story of the Lycan King, a ruthless alpha whose heart is a fortress of ice. For a century, he has ruled with brutal efficiency, his control absolute. But when a human historian named Elara trespasses on his lands, his inner wolf awakens with a single, soul-shattering word: mine. What follows is a storm of forbidden passion, a primal claiming, and a war against a traitor who wants to use his newfound weakness to destroy him completely. Prepare to see a side of the monster you never thought possible. This is a story of suspense, steam, and a love so powerful it can tame the most savage beast. If that's your kind of escape, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now, so you never miss a single thrilling chapter of our journey. And now, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare to be claimed. Chapter 1. The Shadow of the King. The scent of pine and damp earth was thick in the air, a familiar perfume that did little to soothe the tension coiling in Kaelen's gut. He stood on the precipice of Blackwood Ridge, the highest point in his sprawling territory, a king surveying his domain. Below, the endless sea of ancient forest was his, a kingdom carved from wilderness and held by fear. His title, the Lycan King, was not a token. It was a brand seared into the minds of every werewolf on the continent, a name synonymous with brutal efficiency and absolute control. Tonight, that control was being tested. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of blood and ozone. A storm was brewing, both in the bruised purple clouds overhead and in the valley below. His pack, the Blackwood Sentinels, were gathered, their forms a mix of hulking man and monstrous wolf, their eyes glowing with anticipation in the deepening twilight. They were waiting for his judgment. Bring him forward. Kaelen's voice was a low growl, a sound that rumbled through the very rock beneath their feet. Two of his betas, Jax and Ronan, dragged a bloodied wolf from the shadows. The shifter, barely more than a boy, was forced to his knees. He was from the Silver Creek pack, a foolish pup who had thought to challenge Kaelen's border. A poacher. You know the law, Silver Creek, Kaelen said, descending from the ridge with a predator's grace. His movements were fluid, silent, every inch of his 6.5-foot frame radiating lethal power. He wore no shirt, his torso a roadmap of scars that told tales of 100 victories. My land is not for the taking. My game is not for your table. The young wolf spat blood. My alpha will. Your alpha is a coward who sends children to do his dirty work. Kaelen cut him off, circling him slowly. The pack remained silent, a gallery of stone-faced killers watching their king. Fear was a tool, and Kaelen wielded it with surgical precision. It was the shadow he cast, the thing that kept his enemies at bay and his allies in line. He hoped you might find a weakness, a crack in my armor. Kaelen stopped in front of the kneeling wolf, crouching to look him in the eye. The boy's bravado finally shattered, replaced by the stark, primal terror Kaelen knew so well. It was a look he had seen 1,000 times. Tell me. Kaelen's voice dropped to a deceptively soft whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. Did you find one? The wolf trembled, unable to speak. With a sigh that was almost bored, Kaelen rose. There is no weakness here. He turned his back on the prisoner, a sign of ultimate dismissal. Jax, make an example of him. Send a piece back to his alpha. A warning. Jax nodded, his jaw tight. And the rest? Leave it for the crows, Kaelen stated, his word absolute. He walked away as the boy's terrified pleas were silenced with a final, sickening crack. This was his nature. This was the cold calculus of power. Mercy was a luxury he could not afford, a softness that would be exploited before the sun rose again. He felt nothing but the familiar, icy resolve that had forged his crown. But then, as the first drops of rain began to fall, a new scent cut through the storm. It was faint, carried on a gust of wind from the human town nestled miles away at the edge of his territory. It wasn't the usual scent of wood smoke and exhaust. This was different. It was intoxicating, vanilla and rain-soaked wildflowers, with an undertone of something uniquely, inexplicably her. Kaelen froze, his head snapping up. His inner wolf, a beast of pure rage and instinct that he had dominated for decades, stirred violently. It clawed at the inside of his chest, not with aggression, but with a desperate, unfamiliar yearning. Every ruthless instinct, every cold calculation, every ounce of his legendary control was suddenly assaulted by that one impossible scent. It was a scent that promised a weakness he never knew he had. Mate. The word echoed not in his ears, but in his soul, a primal recognition that threatened to shatter his ironclad world. And for the first time in a century, the Lycan King felt a tremor of something other than rage. He felt a terrifying, consuming need. Chapter 2. The Scent of Rain. Elara pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the cabin window, watching the storm roll in over the mountains. Rain lashed against the panes in furious waves, blurring the formidable wall of trees that surrounded her small, rented refuge. She had come here for silence, for the kind of profound solitude that only a forest untouched by time could offer. After the noise and betrayal of her old life, a cheating fiancé, and a career that had stalled, the quiet was supposed to be a balm. Instead, it felt watchful. A shiver traced its way down her spine, a prickling sensation at the nape of her neck that had become her constant companion for the past 2 days. It was the feeling of being observed, a primitive instinct she couldn't shake. She dismissed it as paranoia, a city girl's unease with the raw, untamed wilderness. Here, the snap of a twig could sound like a footstep, and the wind could whisper like a voice. She pushed away from the window, pulling her worn cardigan tighter around herself. The main room of the cabin was cozy, with a stone fireplace where a low fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She was a researcher, a historian, and her work was her last remaining passion. Her current project was a deep dive into local folklore, the legends of the region. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of spirits and beasts that roamed these woods, particularly the story of a so-called Lycan King. It was fascinating, the kind of myth that was born from a healthy fear of the dark and the deep woods. Picking up a leather-bound book from the table, she traced the faded title, Whispers of the Blackwood. The previous tenant had left it behind. It was full of chilling tales, but one passage had stuck with her. He is the shadow that hunts, the fury in the storm. They say his heart is stone, that he feels nothing but rage. But the legend warns that every monster has a weakness, a single tether to the world it has forsaken. A log popped in the fireplace, startling her. Elara laughed at her own jumpiness, placing the book back down. It was just a story, but the feeling of being watched intensified. She found her gaze drawn back to the window, to the impenetrable darkness between the trees. Was that a flicker of movement? The glint of eyes? Get a grip, Elara, she muttered, forcing herself to turn away and head to the small kitchen to make tea. The kettle had just begun to whistle when an electrifying jolt shot through her body. It was a strange, powerful pull, a sudden awareness that bloomed in her chest like a hothouse flower. It was illogical, inexplicable, a magnetic tug toward the woods outside. At the exact same moment, a scent filled her senses. So vivid it was as if its source was standing right next to her. It was the smell of a thunderstorm and wild, dark earth, of pine and something musky and intensely masculine. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague paranoia. It was a certainty. He was out there, driven by an impulse she couldn't understand. Elara walked to the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. The whistling kettle screamed in the background, a a frantic counterpoint to the sudden, heavy silence that had fallen outside. The rain had stopped. She opened the door just a crack, peering into the storm-washed night. The air was crisp, charged with energy. And there, at the edge of the clearing, standing just beyond the reach of her porch light, was a figure. He was a silhouette of impossible size and stillness, a man carved from the night itself. She couldn't see his features clearly, but she could feel the weight of his stare, a gaze so intense it seemed to pin her in place. He was the source of that scent, of that pull, of the fear and a terrifying new flicker of attraction. This was no local hunter. This was no lost hiker. Her rational mind screamed at her to slam the door, to bolt it, to hide. But her body was frozen, held captive by the raw, predatory power that radiated from him in palpable waves. He was the monster from the Fireside Tales. And he was here. Chapter 3. The King and His Claim. The man at the edge of the clearing took a step forward, and the world seemed to hold its breath. The porchlight caught him then, and Elara's breath hitched. He was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. His face was all harsh planes and sharp angles, a warrior's face framed by shoulder-length black hair, still damp from the rain. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a piercing, wolfish gold, burning with an intelligence and intensity that stripped her bare. He moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. Every muscle in his powerful, scarred torso was coiled with tension. He was the apex predator, the king of this dark, wild domain, and she was an intruder. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden quiet. Her hand, slick with sweat, gripped the edge of the door. Run! The single word screamed through her mind, but her feet were rooted to the spot, caught in the tractor beam of his gaze. He stopped a few feet from the porch steps, his golden eyes raking over her, from her messy bun of auburn hair down to her bare feet. It wasn't a lecherous look. It was assessing, possessive. It felt as though he were seeing not just her, but into her, peeling back layers to the very core of her soul. "You are on my land," he finally spoke. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the wooden planks beneath her feet. It was the voice from the storm, the growl of thunder given human form. Elara found her own voice, though it came out shaky. "This is a rental cabin. The owner knows the rules," he interrupted, his gaze never wavering. "No one comes this deep into the Blackwood, not without my permission." The arrogance, the sheer authority in his tone, sparked a flicker of defiance through her fear. "I didn't see a no trespassing sign signed by the king of the forest," she retorted, her chin lifting slightly, a muscle feathered in his jaw. A ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile touched his lips, a dangerous, predatory curve. The creatures in these woods do not need signs. They know the scent of their sovereign. He took another step, ascending the first porch step. The primal scent of him, storm, pine, and pure male dominance, washed over her, and her knees went weak. "What are you?" he asked, his voice softer now, yet more intense. It wasn't a question of her name or her occupation. It was deeper, more fundamental. "I'm a historian," she managed, her mind reeling. His eyes narrowed. "A human." He said the word like a curse, a puzzle he couldn't solve. The air between them crackled, thick with an unseen energy. He was so close now, she could see the flecks of amber in his golden irises, could feel the heat radiating from his skin. His inner wolf, the beast she had only read about in folklore, was warring with the man. She could sense it in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "My wolf," he growled, moored himself into her, "screams a word I have not heard in a century. It screams mine." Elara's mind went blank with shock. Mine. The word echoed in the space between them, a claim as old as time. The legends she'd been reading, they weren't just stories. The pull she felt, the scent she craved, it was all real. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through her again, but this time it was tangled with a terrifying, exhilarating thread of something else. Fascination. Awe. Attraction. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered, taking a stumbling step back into the cabin. In a flash, he was there, his large frame filling the doorway, blocking her retreat, plunging the room into a shadow. He reached out, his callous fingers gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of lightning that shot straight to her core. Her entire body flushed with heat. His expression was a mask of raw conflict. His wolf wanted to claim. The man, the ruthless king, wanted to dominate. You are a complication I cannot afford, he murmured, his thumb stroking her jawline, his gaze dropping to her lips. And yet, I find I am not willing to let you go. Before she could process his words, before she could scream or run, he moved with blinding speed. He swept her into his arms, one powerful arm locking around her waist, the other behind her knees. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing. What are you doing? She gasped, her hands flying to his chest, pushing against a wall of unyielding muscle. He ignored her struggles, turning from the cabin and striding out into the night, carrying her as his prize. His golden eyes burned down at her, filled with a terrifying mix of fury and possession. I am the Lycan King, he growled, his voice leaving no room for argument. And you, human, are now my prisoner. Chapter 4, The Gilded Cage. Kaelen didn't take her to a dungeon of cold stone and iron bars. The reality was far more disorienting. He carried her through the dark, silent forest with an unerring sense of direction, his long strides eating up the ground. Elara struggled at first, but his arms were like steel bands, and her fists beat uselessly against the hard muscle of his chest. The raw power emanating from him was overwhelming, silencing her protests until all she could do was cling to him. Her face pressed against the warmth of his skin, her senses filled with his intoxicating scent. He brought her to a massive lodge built of dark timber and river stone, a structure that seemed to have grown from the forest floor itself. It was more fortress than home, grand and intimidating, yet a warm light glowed from within. Inside, the gilded cage was revealed. The main hall was vast, with a vaulted ceiling crossed by enormous wooden beams and a fireplace large enough to roast an ox. Animal pelts were strewn over plush leather furniture, and ornate tapestries depicting savage wolf hunts adorned the walls. It was a place of immense wealth and barbaric splendor. He finally set her on her feet, in the center of a luxurious wolfskin rug. For a moment, she just stood there, trembling, taking in the sheer scale of the room and the silent, hulking figures that stood in the shadows. Members of his pack. Their glowing eyes watched her with a mixture of suspicion, curiosity, and outright hostility. The air was thick with their silent judgment. No one is to harm her. Kaelen's voice boomed through the hall, a clear and final command. The wolves visibly relaxed, their gazes softening from threat to grudging acceptance. She is under my protection. He dismissed them with a flick of his wrist, and they melted back into the shadows, leaving the two of them alone in the cavernous space. Protection? Elara found her voice, lacing it with all the sarcasm she could muster. You call kidnapping protection? Here, it is one and the same, he replied, turning to face her. He had pulled on a simple black shirt, but it did little to diminish his intimidating presence. Out there, he gestured vaguely toward the forest. You would not survive a single night. My rivals would see you as a weapon against me. My own pack would see you as a weakness. Here, you are merely mine. He led her to a large, richly furnished bedroom on the second floor. A fire was already roaring in the hearth, and a four-poster bed draped in furs dominated the space. A private balcony offered a breathtaking, if terrifying, view of the moonlit mountains. You will stay here, he said. It was not a request. You will be brought food, You will not try to leave. The days that followed were a strange torment. Elara was a prisoner, yet she was treated with a confusing reverence. She was given beautiful clothes, delicious meals, and any book she desired from a vast, ancient library she discovered. But the door was always guarded, and Kaelen's presence was a constant, oppressive weight, even when he wasn't there. He would visit her each evening. He never touched her, but his intense, golden gaze would follow her every move. They would talk, their conversations a battle of wills. She peppered him with questions about his world, her historian's curiosity overriding her fear. He was tight-lipped, answering in clipped, grudging sentences, yet he seemed intrigued by her defiance, by the fact that she met his gaze instead of cowering. She saw the monster, the ruthless alpha, when he dealt with his pack. She heard the shouts, the snarls, the sounds of brutal discipline from beyond her door. She witnessed the absolute fear he commanded. But with her, she saw something else. It was in the flicker of his eyes when she laughed at a passage in a book, in the way his jaw would clench when he brought her a meal and her fingers brushed his. It was a deep, guttural conflict. The Lycan King, a creature of absolute power, was fighting a war against his own soul. He desired her, his wolf's instinct screaming at him to claim his mate, but his mind, conditioned by centuries of solitude and rule, saw her as a human, a fragile liability. One evening, a storm raged outside, mirroring the one on the night he took her. He stood on her balcony, staring into the maelstrom, his back to her. "Why am I here, Kaelen?" she asked softly, using his name for the first time. He turned slowly, his face a mask of torment. "Because the moment I saw you, I was lost. Because for the first time in my life, my wolf and I want the same thing. And it terrifies me." He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping directly in front of her. The heat from his body was a physical force. He raised a hand, his knuckles gently grazing her cheek. His control was fraying, the raw, primal need in his eyes making her breath catch. "You have ignited a fire in me, Elara," he rasped, his voice thick with a desire he could no longer conceal. "A fire I have kept banked in ice for 100 years. I fear it will consume us both." His head lowered, his lips just a breath from hers. The tension was a living thing, a coiled serpent ready to strike. This was the moment. The monster was yielding, not to an enemy, but to her. And in that terrifying, exhilarating instant, she realized she didn't want to run. She wanted to be consumed. Chapter 5. The blood of the bond. The world narrowed to the space between their lips. The scent of him, the raw heat of his body, the possessive fire in his golden eyes. It was a sensory overload that bypassed all of Elara's rational thought. Her own hands, acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed, came up to rest on his chest. She could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his heart beneath her palms, a rhythm as wild as the storm outside. But just as his mouth was about to claim hers, a piercing howl ripped through the night. It was not a call of the pack. It was a shriek of alarm. Kaelen jerked back, his entire body going rigid. The look of tormented desire was instantly replaced by the cold, lethal mask of the king. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Bar the door." He was gone before she could answer, a blur of motion that left the room feeling cold and empty. Elara rushed to the door, her heart pounding, and slid the heavy iron bolt into place. She ran to the balcony, peering down into the courtyard below. What she saw made her blood run cold. At least a dozen massive wolves, their fur matted, and their eyes glowing with red malice, were swarming the lodge. They were not his pack. They were leaner, mangier, moving with a chaotic, vicious energy. Rogues. They clashed with Kaelen's sentinels, a whirlwind of snapping jaws and tearing claws. And then she saw him. Kaelen launched himself from a first-floor balcony, shifting midair. The transformation was seamless, terrifying and breathtaking. Man became beast in the blink of an eye. He was a colossal black wolf, nearly twice the size of any other. A true monster of nightmare and legend. He landed amidst the intruders with a ground-shaking impact, a force of pure, untamed fury. He was magnificent. He was death incarnate. He moved through the enemy pack, not as a soldier, but as a god of war, his jaws crushing bone, his claws eviscerating any who dared to face him. From her vantage point, Elara saw one of the rogue wolves break from the main fight. It ignored the guards, its red eyes fixed unervingly on her balcony. It saw her. It knew she was here. It wasn't just a random attack, it was targeted. They were after her. Panic seized her. The wolf crouched, its powerful haunches bunching as it prepared to leap up the rock-faced walls. It would reach her in seconds. She scrambled back, tripping over a chair and landing hard on the wooden floor. Suddenly, a black shadow blotted out the moonlight. Kaelen, in his wolf form, landed on the balcony with a deafening snarl that shook the entire structure. He placed his enormous body between Elara and the rogue below, a living shield of muscle and rage. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, possessive fury that promised a painful death to any who dared to touch what was his. The rogue below whimpered, its courage breaking, and scurried back into the shadows. Kaelen turned his massive head, his golden eyes finding hers. She saw no trace of the man in them, only the raw, undiluted instinct of the beast, the alpha, the mate. He nudged her with his wet nose, a surprisingly gentle gesture, before turning and leaping back into the fray below to finish the slaughter. The fight ended as quickly as it began. The survivors fled into the forest, leaving their dead behind. A few moments later, Kaelen returned, striding back into her room in human form. He was splattered with blood, his chest heaving, his eyes still burning with the golden fire of his wolf. A long, deep gash ran along his ribs, bleeding freely. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his gaze scanning her frantically. "No, I'm fine." "You're the one who's bleeding," she cried, rushing forward. He barely seemed to notice his own wound. "They came for you," he growled, grabbing her shoulders, his grip just short of painful. "They sensed a human here. They sensed my distraction, my weakness." The word hung in the air, the very thing he had denied having just days ago. "You are not weak," she whispered, her hand coming up to touch his blood-streaked face. Her touch seemed to break him. With a guttural groan, he crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was savage, desperate, a release of all the pent-up tension and fear and primal need of the past few days. It was a brand, a claim, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. He tasted of the storm and of blood, and she met his ferocity with a yearning she could no longer deny. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing heavily. His golden eyes stared into hers, stripped of all artifice, all control. The king and the beast were one, and they both wanted only her. "Mine," he breathed against her lips, the word a sacred vow. He sealed it with another kiss, deeper this time, a promise of a bond forged in violence, and sealed by a passion that would either save them or burn their world to the ground. Chapter 6. A King's Tenderness. The world rushed back in with the slamming of the heavy wooden door, leaving Elara alone in the aftermath. The scent of Kaelen, of blood and possessive rage, clung to the air. Her lips still tingled from the raw, bruising force of his kiss, a kiss that had been a declaration of war on his own solitude. She touched her mouth, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. He had called her his weakness, but in that moment, she had felt a strength in him that was terrifying and thrilling. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, but one image burned through the chaos, the deep, bleeding gash on his side. He had dismissed it, his focus entirely on her safety, but she had seen how it bled, dark and steady. The king was wounded, Driven by an impulse that was stronger than her fear, she unbolted the door and slipped out. The great hall was quiet now, the bodies of the dead rogues already removed. A few sentinels stood guard, their faces grim, and they watched her with wary eyes as she descended the main staircase. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the entrance to a long, stone corridor from which she could hear muffled voices. She found him in a cavernous chamber that looked like a war room, leaning heavily over a massive wooden table carved with a map of the territory. Jax was with him, along with a stern-looking older female wolf Elara hadn't seen before. Double the patrols on the eastern ridge. I want scouts watching Silas's every move. Kaelen was growling, his voice strained. He straightened up, and a sharp intake of breath betrayed his pain. You're hurt, Elara said, her voice cutting through the strategic discussion. 3 pairs of predatory eyes snapped to her. Jax's held surprise, the older females, pure disdain, but Kaelen's eyes held a complex storm of anger, shock, and a flicker of something she couldn't name. I told you to stay in the room, he bit out, his authority absolute. You're bleeding through your shirt, she retorted, taking a step into the room. Her defiance hung in the air, a challenge no one in this lodge had likely ever offered him. That needs to be cleaned and stitched. The older female scoffed. The alpha does not need a human fussing over him. Lyra, enough, Kaelen commanded, his gaze locked on Elara. He saw the genuine concern in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, and something in his own expression shifted. The king relented. Leave us. Jax and Lyra looked as though they wanted to argue, but a low growl from Kaelen sent them from the room, the older female casting a look of pure venom at Elara as she left. Silence descended. Kaelen watched her, his defenses momentarily down, the sheer exhaustion from the fight, and the adrenaline crash evident on his face. They were led by a shifter named Silas, he said, his voice quiet. He was once one of mine, exiled for his insatiable cruelty. He preys on weakness, and tonight, he thought he had found mine. By hurting you, he proves nothing, Elara said softly, approaching him cautiously. Let me see it. He hesitated for a long second before giving a stiff nod. He pulled the torn, blood-soaked fabric of his shirt away, and Elara gasped. The wound was long and deep, a vicious claw mark that ran from his ribs to his hip. With gentle hands, she guided him to a chair. She found a basin, water, and clean cloths, her movements calm and efficient. As she began to clean the wound, her fingers tracing the edges of the raw flesh, the tension in the room became thick and suffocating. His skin was hot beneath her touch. She could feel the tightly coiled power in his muscles, the steady thump of his heart. He sat perfectly still, his gaze burning into her, tracking her every small ministration. This was an intimacy far more profound than the kiss. Here, in this moment of vulnerability, he was letting her in, allowing her to care for the body he used as a weapon and a shield. My father, the king before me, took a mate from a rival pack as a peace treaty, Kaelen murmured, his voice a low rumble. He loved her, and his enemies used that love to break him. They captured her, used her to lure him into a trap. I watched him die for that weakness. His confession was a stone dropping into a deep well, the ripples explaining everything. His cruelty, his isolation, his fear of the very connection his soul now screamed for. I am not your father's mate, she whispered, her eyes meeting his. And you are not him. Her fingers brushed his uninjured skin, and a shudder racked his powerful frame. He reached up, his large hand covering hers, pressing it against his ribs. The bond between them hummed, a current of heat and raw emotion. No, he rasped, his golden eyes filled with a terrifying, beautiful vulnerability. You are mine, and that is a far more dangerous proposition. He did not send her away. When she had finished stitching the wound with a crude needle and thread she found, he followed her back to her room. He did not get in the bed. Instead, he sank into the large armchair by the fire, his long legs stretched out, his gaze never leaving her. The ruthless Alpha, the Lycan King, sat watch over his human mate, a self-appointed guard against a world he had invited into her life. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Pack. Elara awoke to the soft gray light of dawn filtering through the balcony doors. For a moment, she was disoriented, the plush furs and the scent of wood smoke a stark contrast to her simple cabin. Then the memory of the previous night crashed down on her. The attack, the blood, the kiss, the confession. Her eyes darted to the armchair by the fireplace. It was empty. A pang of disappointment, sharp and unwelcome, went through her. The embers in the hearth were cold. He had left hours ago, slipping away like the shadow he was. She was a prisoner once more, the brief, intense connection of the night, now feeling like a fever dream. But something had shifted. She was no longer content to be a passive captive in this gilded cage. Kaelen's story about his father, about the traitor Silas, had ignited a new resolve in her. If she was his weakness, she needed to understand the battlefield. Testing a newfound courage, she opened her bedroom door. The guard who was usually posted there was gone. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out into the hallway. The lodge was stirring, filled with the low murmur of voices and the clatter of a distant kitchen. As she walked toward the great hall, she felt the stares. They were subtle, quick glances from pack members as they passed, but she felt the weight of them all the same. She was an anomaly, a human walking freely in the heart of their fortress. The whispers followed in her wake, too low for her to hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Suspicion, resentment, curiosity. She found her way to a large dining hall where pack members were eating a simple breakfast. The moment she entered, the room fell silent. Dozens of pairs of lupin eyes fixed on her. She saw Jack sitting at a table with other warriors. He gave her a curt, unreadable nod before pointedly turning back to his meal. Her gaze landed on the stern, older female from the night before, Lyra. She sat alone, and her stare was the most piercing of all. It was a look that stripped Elara down, judged her and found her wanting. Mustering her courage, Elara picked up a piece of fruit from a communal bowl and decided to face the hostility head-on. She approached the elders' table. "Good morning," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Lyra looked up slowly, her eyes the color of chips of ice. There is nothing good about a morning that finds a human infesting the Alpha's mind. The insult was sharp, meant to wound. "My name is Elara," she replied, keeping her tone even. "And I am here because your Alpha brought me here." "He brought a vulnerability," Lyra countered, her voice low and raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. "A distraction that nearly cost him his life last night. We smelled it on the rogues. They were not here for territory. They were here for you." The accusation struck a nerve. Elara knew it was true, but hearing it spoken with such venom made her feel the weight of her presence here in a new and terrible way. "He was injured." "Is he?" "He is Alpha." Lyra cut her off. "He heals. It is his heart you should be worried about. It is a thing he has kept locked away for a century for the good of this pack. You are the key to a door that should have remained sealed." Before Elara could respond, Lyra stood, her presence formidable. "I was mated to Kaelen's father. I watched a great man crumble because he put the love of one woman above the survival of his people. Kaelen swore he would never repeat that mistake. Yet here you are." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Know this, human. This pack is a family forged in blood and survival. If you are the cause of its breaking, I will personally tear you apart, Alpha's protection or no." The threat was not idle. Elara could see the raw, protective fury in the old wolf's eyes. She was the matriarch of this violent, insular family, and Elara was the intruder who threatened its very foundation. Lyra turned and walked away, leaving Elara standing alone in the silent, watching hall. The whispers started again, louder this time. She was not just a prisoner of the king anymore. She was an enemy of the pack. The gilded cage had just grown infinitely smaller, and its bars were the resentful eyes of 100 shifters who saw her as a harbinger of their doom. Chapter 8. The Weight of the Crown. Leaving the oppressive atmosphere of the dining hall, Elara wandered the lodge, her sense of isolation more profound than ever. She needed to find Kaelen, to understand the world he commanded, the world that now held her captive. She eventually found him in a room she hadn't seen before. It was a study, but it felt more like a king's council chamber. One wall was dominated by the massive, carved map she had seen before, now dotted with small, sharp stones marking troop movements. The other walls were lined with towering shelves filled not with novels, but with ancient, leather-bound tomes and tightly rolled scrolls. The air smelled of old paper, beeswax, and Kaelen. He stood with his back to her, shirtless, his newly stitched wound a stark red line against his tanned skin. He was speaking in low, clipped tones to 2 scouts who knelt before him, their heads bowed in deference. Their tracks lead toward the Greyfong Pass. Silas is gathering more than just rogues. He's rallying the dispossessed, promising them our lands, our resources. He listened to their report, his jaw tight, his entire posture radiating a cold, lethal authority. Go. Report back by moonrise. The scouts departed without ever acknowledging Elara's presence. Kaelen remained facing the map, his shoulders slumped for a fraction of a second, the immense weight of his crown visible only when he thought he was alone. You should be resting, Elara said softly from the doorway. He turned, his face an impenetrable mask once more. The brief vulnerability from the night before was gone, locked away behind the eyes of the king. Rest is a luxury I do not have. Lyra seems to think I am the reason for that. A muscle in his jaw twitched. Lyra's duty is to the pack. Her memory is long and her heart is scarred. Pay her no mind. How can I not? She's right, Elara said, stepping further into the room. She had found a tray with bread and cheese left outside his door, untouched. She had brought it with her, a simple, human gesture in this place of beasts and warriors. She set it on the edge of a large oak desk. The attack was because of me. You were hurt because of me. You are not a strategist, Elara. Do not presume to understand the complexities of this war, he stated coldly, though his eyes flickered to the food she had brought. Silas has wanted my throne for decades. He would have used any excuse to attack. You were merely a convenient one. But his words fell hollow, a lie to protect either her or himself. He walked over to the desk, his proximity immediately charging the air. He didn't take the food. Instead, he leaned over a scroll, his powerful body caging her in against the desk. She could feel the heat of him, smell the clean, masculine scent that was uniquely his, a scent that made her pulse quicken despite the gravity of their conversation. For 100 years, my focus has been singular. Protect the pack, hold the territory, he murmured, his gaze fixed on the ancient script of the scroll. But his words were for her. My mind was a fortress, clear, sharp, cold. Now, he finally looked at her, his golden eyes burning with a frustrated fire. Now there is you, a constant hum beneath the surface. When I am planning a defense, my wolf is wondering if you're safe. When I am interrogating a prisoner, I am distracted by the memory of your scent. You are a fever in my blood, and I am the leader of a kingdom on the brink of war. He pushed off the desk and began to pace, the caged energy of his wolf pouring off him. Silas knows my history. He knows what happened to my father. He believes he has found the same chink in my armor. He thinks he can break me by using you. The suspense of their situation became a tangible thing. This wasn't just about a rogue wolf. It was a calculated, personal vendetta. Silas wasn't just attacking a rival. He was reopening the deepest wound of Kaelen's past. He stopped in front of her, his control slipping. He reached out, his fingers tangling in her hair, his thumb stroking her cheek. I brought you here to contain the threat, to keep you close where I could protect you. But in doing so, I have brought the war to my very door. His head dipped, his lips hovering a hair's breadth from hers. And the Maker help me, he growled, the sound a mix of anguish and desire. I still don't know if I should cage you or claim you. The promise and the threat of both options hung between them, more dangerous than any army Silas could muster. Chapter 9. A Glimmer of Freedom. For 2 days, Elara remained in the study, becoming a silent shadow as Kaelen commanded his kingdom. She read the ancient histories from his shelves, trying to piece together the laws and lineage of his people. She listened as he interrogated scouts and issued commands, her mind absorbing every detail of the threat they faced. She saw the king, the strategist, the ruthless leader who inspired terror and loyalty in equal measure. And in the quiet moments, when exhaustion etched lines on his face, she saw the man, haunted and burdened. The tension between them was a constant, simmering heat. They rarely spoke of anything personal, but his eyes would follow her, and sometimes a simple brush of their hands, as she gave him a cup of water, would make the air crackle. On the 3rd day, the oppressive confinement began to wear on her. She felt sluggish, her mind clouded. She found him staring at the map, his brow furrowed in concentration. I need to go outside, she said, the words coming out more as a plea than a demand. I need air. Sunlight. He turned, his expression unreadable. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the pale tint to her skin, the restlessness in her eyes. She was a creature of the sun, and he was keeping her in the shadows. His gaze softened infinitesimally. Jax, he called out, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. The beta appeared in the doorway moments later, his face a neutral mask. Alpha. Escort her, Kaelen commanded. The grounds of the lodge only. Stay within the first perimeter. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will have your hide. The threat was delivered with icy calm, and Jax simply nodded. Yes, Alpha. A glimmer of freedom. It was more than she had hoped for. Walking beside the silent, hulking beta, Elara stepped out of the lodge's great doors and into the crisp mountain air. The sunlight was so bright it made her dizzy for a moment. The lodge was situated in a natural clearing, surrounded by a formidable stone wall on 3 sides, while the 4th was the sheer cliff face of the mountain it was built against. The grounds within the walls were surprisingly beautiful, with ancient, gnarled oaks and patches of hardy wildflowers. But it was the wall that drew her attention. It was high and thick, patrolled by sentinels whose glowing eyes watched her every move. Her freedom was still an illusion. He trusts you, Elara said, breaking the silence between her and her guard. Jax grunted, his eyes scanning the perimeter ceaselessly. My life is sworn to him. Because he is your alpha? Because he is worthy of it, Jax replied. The words clipped. Elara sensed an opening, a chance to understand the pack she was now inextricably tied to. Lyra doesn't think so. Not anymore. She thinks I've made him weak. Jax was silent for a long moment. Lyra is traditional, he finally said, choosing his words carefully. She fears history repeating itself. What she doesn't understand is that the Alpha is not his father. He rules with his head, not his heart. He glanced at her, a flicker of something, perhaps warning, in his eyes. At least he always has. As they walked near the edge of the tree line, Jack suddenly stopped. He crouched, his fingers tracing something in the soft earth. Elara followed his gaze and saw it. A single, massive paw print, larger and deeper than those of the pack wolves she had seen. It was fresh. What is it? She whispered. Rogue, Jax growled, his hand instinctively going to the large knife sheathed at his belt. They're testing the perimeter, getting bolder. The air grew cold. The beauty of the grounds vanished, replaced by a sense of imminent danger. The enemy was not some distant threat on a map. They were here, just beyond the walls, watching, waiting. The cage she was in, the guards, the king's oppressive protection. It was all suddenly, terrifyingly justified. Jax straightened up, his body a coiled spring of lethal readiness. We're going back inside. Now. His urgency was contagious. As he led her quickly back toward the safety of the lodge, Elara looked back at the dark, silent forest. She felt 100 unseen eyes on her, and she understood a fundamental truth of this place. Freedom was not about being outside the walls. Survival was about being on the right side of them, and she was trapped on the inside with a king who was just as much a predator as the ones waiting in the woods. Chapter 10. The Mating Heat. The full moon was 3 nights away. Elara knew this not from a calendar, but from the shift in the very air of the lodge. A restless, volatile energy began to thrum beneath the surface of the pack's disciplined routines. Tempers were shorter, movements were sharper, and the low growls of dominance disputes echoed more frequently in the halls. It was a primal energy that seeped into the stones, an ancient rhythm that her human senses could feel, even if they couldn't understand it. But the most profound change was in Kaelen. He began to avoid her. After the incident at the perimeter, he had confined her to her rooms and the study once more. But where he had once been a constant, brooding presence, he now kept his distance. He would leave food by her door. He held his war councils in a different chamber. If they passed in the hall, he would turn away, his body rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly she was afraid his teeth would shatter. The rejection was a physical ache, a cold void where the heat of the bond had once hummed. She felt his absence like a missing limb. Confused and hurt, she tried to corner him, to demand an explanation, but he was always a step ahead, a shadow retreating just as she approached. On the eve of the full moon, the energy in the lodge reached a fever pitch. The air was electric, and the distant sounds of howling were wilder, more unrestrained. Elara couldn't bear the silent treatment any longer. The bond was a frantic, desperate thing inside her. Screaming for proximity to him, she sought him out, her search growing more frantic until she was directed by a nervous pack member to the training yard. It was a large, sunken arena behind the lodge, built for combat. And there he was. He was fighting. Not one opponent, but 3 of his largest betas, including Jax. He was shirtless, his body drenched in sweat that highlighted every taut muscle and jagged scar. He moved with a brutal, desperate grace, his fists flying, his body a whirlwind of controlled violence. This wasn't training, it was a punishment. He was pushing himself to the absolute brink of exhaustion, trying to beat something inside himself into submission. He dispatched the last beta with a move so fast Elara barely saw it, leaving the warrior gasping on the ground. Kaelen stood in the center of the arena, his chest heaving, his head bowed. He was the victor, but he looked like a man in agony. "What is wrong with you?" Elara's voice cut through his ragged breaths. She stood at the edge of the arena, her arms wrapped around herself. "Why are you avoiding me?" He didn't look up. "Go back to your room, Elara." The words were a low, guttural command. "No, not until you tell me what I did." "You did nothing," he growled, finally lifting his head. His eyes were no longer just gold. They were burning, molten spheres of pure instinct. The man was almost gone. The beast was at the surface. "You simply exist. And right now, that is more than I can bear." He vaulted out of the training pit, landing silently before her. The heat rolled off him in waves, carrying the scent of sweat, blood, and a musk of raw, untamed arousal that made her go weak at the knees. "The moon," he rasped, his voice thick and strained. "It amplifies everything, every instinct, every desire. For a shifter, the pull to true mate is strong on any day. Under the full moon. He shook his head. A violent, tormented motion. It becomes a storm. A fire. A primal need so strong it can burn away all reason. They call it the mating heat. The air between them was so thick she could barely breathe. The truth of his withdrawal slammed into her. He wasn't rejecting her. He was protecting her from himself. "My wolf wants you," he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he took a step closer. "He doesn't want to talk. He doesn't want a reason. He wants to claim, to possess, to mark you as his, in every way a male can mark a female. He wants to drag you to his den and keep you there until the moon wanes." He was so close now. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. His burning gaze dropped to her mouth, and a low, possessive growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that vibrated through her bones and settled deep in her core. "I am trying to control a beast that is screaming at me to make you mine," he confessed, his anguish palpable. "I am afraid, Elara. Not of Silas, not of war. I am afraid of hurting you. Afraid of being the monster you already believe I am." With a final, tortured look, he turned and strode away, his powerful body rigid with a control she now understood was costing him everything. She watched him go, until he reached his chambers and slammed the heavy oak door shut, the sound echoing through the courtyard like a prison gate. He had locked himself in, he had caged the beast, and he had left her alone on the outside, her own body humming with a strange, new heat, a desire that mirrored his, leaving her to face the coming storm by herself. Chapter 11. The Elder's Test. The sound of Kaelen's door slamming shut was a final, devastating blow. Elara stood frozen in the twilight, the primal energy of the coming night pressing in on her. The mating heat he spoke of was not just his burden to bear. A strange, insistent warmth was coiling in her own belly, a deep, illogical yearning to be near him, beast and all. She felt his agony through the bond as a sharp, physical pain in her own chest. Shaking, she turned to go back to her room, but a figure blocked her path. It was Lyra. The elder's face was grim in the fading light, her icy eyes missing nothing of Elara's distress. "So the Alpha cages himself," Lyra stated, her voice devoid of sympathy. "A king, brought to heel by the scent of a human. Pathetic. He's doing it to protect me." Elara shot back, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "He is doing it because he is weak," Lyra corrected her coldly. "Because he allows his heart, his wolf, to rule him. This is how the fall begins. I have seen it before." Lyra's gaze was unyielding. "Come with me," she commanded, turning and walking back toward the lodge. It was not a request. Hesitantly, Elara followed her, the bond pulling her toward Kaelen's door, while this strange, formidable woman led her in the opposite direction. Lyra led her to a part of the lodge Elara had never seen, a series of quiet chambers that smelled of dried herbs, beeswax, and ancient dust. This was the healer's wing. Lyra's private room was like a witch's apothecary from one of her history books. Bunches of herbs hung from the ceiling, and shelves were crammed with clay pots, glass vials, and yellowed scrolls. The elder lit a candle, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on her severe face. "When I was a young she-wolf," Lyra began, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, "I was mated to Kaelen's father, Alistair. He was a strong alpha, a kind one, too kind. He loved me and I him, but his love made him distracted. When our enemies, the very ancestors of the Phil Silas now leads, threatened us, he made decisions based on my safety, not the pack's. He would divert warriors to guard me, leaving borders weakened. He would hesitate to strike if I was in perceived danger." She paused, her eyes dark with memory. Silas was Alistair's beta then. Ambitious, cunning. He saw the Alpha's devotion not as a strength, but as a flaw to be exploited. He arranged for me to be captured, just as he will try with you. Alistair walked into Silas's trap to save me, and it cost him his life. Kaelen watched it all. The story was a chilling echo of Kaelen's own words, but twisted. The blame laid not on the betrayer, but on the love itself. Kaelen swore on his father's grave that he would be a king of stone and ice. Lyra continued, her gaze pinning Elara. He has ruled for a century with unmatched strength because he had no weakness. Until you. She turned to a dark wooden chest and opened it. From within, she removed a small, corked vial filled with a dark, viscous liquid. She placed it on the table between them. This is my test for you, human, Lyra said, her voice dropping low. You claim to care for him. If that is true, you will want to ease his suffering. This is wolfsbane, mixed with other herbs. A potent concoction. It will not harm him permanently. Elara stared at the vial, her heart sinking. What will it do? It will dull the bond, Lyra explained. It will sever the connection just enough to quell the mating heat. It will give him relief, clarity. It will allow the king to rule, without the distraction of the beast. He will be free of this madness you have inflicted upon him. The suspense of the choice was suffocating. Take away his pain. Give him back the cold control he cherished. It was a tempting offer, a logical solution. But Lyra's words held a double meaning. Sever the connection. It would not be temporary. A bond, once dulled, might never regain its fire. Lyra saw the conflict in her eyes. If your feelings are a frivolous human fancy, you will walk away. But if you truly love him, you will set him free. You will give him back his strength, even if it means he no longer feels anything for you. It was a cruel, brilliant test. To prove her love, she had to destroy it. The vial sat on the table, a dark promise of peace and an eternity of emptiness. Her choice would determine not only Kaelen's fate, but the fate of their entire, fragile connection. Chapter 12. The Choice and the Storm. Elara stared at the dark liquid in the vial. It represented an easy path, a way to end the torment that was tearing Kaelen apart. She could give him back his icy control, his fortress of solitude. She could remove herself, the weakness, from the equation. Lyra watched her, her face an unreadable mask, judging her every flicker of emotion. The bond, however, was a living thing inside Elara. It recoiled from the vial, screaming a silent, primal no. It was a connection that went beyond logic, a pull of souls that had been adrift until they found their anchor in each other. To dull, it would be like cutting out her own heart to stop it from aching. No, Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. Lyra's eyebrows shot up in surprise. His pain is my pain, Elara continued, meeting the elder's icy gaze without flinching. This bond, it isn't a disease to be cured. It's who he is. It's who we are. You see it as a weakness, but you're wrong. The fact that he can feel this, after a century of solitude, is a sign of incredible strength, not a flaw. I will not be the one to poison it. She pushed the vial back across the table. I will not choose the easy path for him. I will face the storm with him. A long, heavy silence filled the room. Lyra stared at Elara, her expression shifting from cold judgment to something complex and unreadable. A flicker of grudging respect ignited in the depths of her old eyes. You are a fool, the elder finally rasped, or you're stronger than any human I have ever known. Without another word, she took the vial and turned away, a silent dismissal. Elara left the apothecary, her heart pounding with the conviction of her choice. As she stepped out into the main corridor, a low rumble of thunder shook the lodge. The storm that had been threatening for days had finally arrived, a perfect mirror for the turmoil within. Rain began to lash against the high windows, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. The full moon was rising. She could feel it. The energy in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The bond was a taut wire, humming with an agonizing frequency, pulling her inexorably toward one place, Kaelen's chambers. She knew he was suffering, She could feel the echo of his struggle, the desperate battle for control. He had locked himself away to protect her. But her decision in Lyra's room had changed everything. She would not hide from his beast. She would face it. She would face him. Her feet carried her down the familiar hallway, the sounds of the storm outside masking her approach. She reached his door, the heavy oak a formidable barrier. She could feel him on the other side, a palpable presence of caged, primal power. Fear, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat, but a stronger emotion pushed it down. A fierce, protective love for the man and the monster trapped together in that room. This was not a decision born of logic. It was an act of pure, instinctual faith. She was no longer a prisoner choosing to obey. She was a woman choosing her mate, choosing her fate. Her hand trembled as she reached for the iron latch. There was no lock on the outside. He hadn't barred her from entry. He had only barred himself from exit. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Elara lifted the latch. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan, opening into darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, and the only sound was the raging storm and a low, guttural growl that emanated from the shadows within. She stepped across the threshold, into the storm. Chapter 13. Claimed by the King. The room was a vortex of chaos and raw power. Lightning flashed, illuminating a scene of destruction. A heavy oak table was overturned, chairs were splintered, and deep claw marks scored the stone walls. In the center of the room stood Kaelen, or what was left of him. He was a terrifying silhouette against the storm-lashed windows, his body trembling with the sheer effort of containing the beast within. His eyes were no longer flecked with gold. They were solid, glowing embers of lupin fire. His muscles were corded with tension, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. A low, continuous growl tore from his throat, a sound of pure, primal agony. He was the epicenter of the storm both inside and out. When he saw her in the doorway, the growl deepened into a possessive, threatening roar that vibrated through the floorboards. It was a clear warning. Mine. Danger. Fear was a tangible thing, a cold hand gripping Elara's heart. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee from the monster. But the bond was a warm, steady anchor. It whispered a different truth. It recognized the pain beneath the rage, the desperation beneath the dominance. "Kaelen," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. At the sound of his name, his head snapped toward her. He took a predatory step forward, his movements no longer entirely human. He was stalking her. The man was lost, submerged beneath a tidal wave of primal instinct. She stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not scream. She did not run. She simply watched him, her eyes trying to find the man she knew within the beast. "Kaelen," she said again, her voice stronger this time, laced with a plea. "I'm here. I'm not afraid of you." It was the lie and the truth all at once. She was terrified, but her resolve to stay was stronger. Her courage, her stillness, seemed to confuse the beast. It halted, its head cocked, the glowing eyes narrowing as it assessed this strange, fearless female who had willingly entered its den. With a shuddering breath, Elara took a step toward him, and another. She was closing the distance, walking toward the epicenter of the hurricane. That final step shattered his remaining control. With a roar that was part anguish and part triumph, he closed the distance in a single, explosive movement, his arms wrapped around her like steel bands, lifting her off her feet and slamming her back against the nearest wall. The impact knocked the wind from her, but she barely noticed. Her entire world had been reduced to him. His mouth crashed down on hers, a savage, claiming kiss that stole her breath and ignited every nerve in her body. It was not the kiss of a man, but the brand of a king claiming his queen, of a wolf marking his mate. It was pure possession, a raw, desperate expression of all the pain and longing he had held back. He tasted of the storm, of ozone and wild, untamed power, and she met him with equal fire, her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his damp hair, pulling him closer. She answered his savage kiss with a desperate yearning of her own, a complete and total surrender to the bond, to him. The beast recognized her surrender. The raw violence in his kiss gentled, just slightly, becoming a deep, consuming passion. He lifted her effortlessly, his mouth never leaving hers, and carried her toward the large bed with its disordered furs. He laid her down, his massive body caging hers, his golden eyes blazing down at her with an intensity that burned straight to her soul. There were no more words. There was only the language of the bond, of touch and scent and overwhelming need. It was a tempest of tangled limbs and desperate sighs, a primal dance of dominance and surrender. This was not a gentle union. It was a collision of two worlds, the claiming he had fought so hard against. It was fierce, passionate, and absolute. Every touch was a brand, every kiss a vow. He was marking her, mind, body, and soul, as his. And as the storm outside reached its crescendo, Elara gave herself over to it completely, claimed not by a monster, but by a king who had finally, irrevocably, found his mate. Chapter 14. The morning after. Elara awoke slowly, cocooned in warmth and the heavy weight of furs. The storm had passed. Soft, clean light filtered into the room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The room was still a wreck, a testament to the tempest of the night before. But the atmosphere was one of profound peace. A heavy arm was draped possessively over her waist, holding her securely against a wall of solid, living heat. She turned her head, her cheek rubbing against the smooth, scarred skin of Kaelen's chest. He was asleep, his face completely transformed. The harsh lines of the king were gone. The tormented mask of the beast had vanished. In its place was a deep, restful calm she had never seen on him. He looked younger. The crushing weight of a century of solitude momentarily lifted. The bond between them was no longer a frantic, aching pull. It was a gentle, steady hum. A warm river flowing peacefully between them. It felt complete, settled. She was a part of him, and he a part of her. She traced the line of a faint scar on his shoulder, and his eyes slowly opened. For a moment, they were just the soft, warm gold of a man waking up next to his lover. Then recognition dawned, and the king's intensity returned, but it was different now. It was not cold or distant. It was focused, possessive, and filled with a raw, new emotion that made her heart skip a beat. "Mine," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble against her ear. He didn't say it like a conqueror, but like a man who had found a precious, long-lost treasure. He rolled, shifting his weight to prop himself up on an elbow, looking down at her. His gaze was reverent as he brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "I did not hurt you." It was the first question he asked, his voice laced with the memory of his own fear. "No," she whispered, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. "You were you. And the wolf. It was all you." A look of profound relief passed over his face. He leaned down and kissed her, and this kiss held none of the savage desperation of the night before. It was deep and slow, and full of a tenderness she never thought him capable of. It was a kiss that spoke of acceptance, of a future. They lay like that for a long time, talking, not as king and prisoner, or as adversaries in a battle of wills, but as equals, as mates. He asked her about her life, her work, the world she came from, his curiosity genuine, and she, in turn, asked him about his. "Lyra told me about your father," she said softly, watching his reaction. She said he died because his love for his mate made him weak. Kaelen's expression hardened, but the coldness was directed at the memory, not at her. "Lyra sees the world through the lens of her own grief," he said, his voice heavy. "She is wrong. My father was not weak. He was betrayed." He sat up, pulling a fur blanket around his waist, the morning light catching the intricate map of scars on his back. Silas didn't just exploit my father's love. He cultivated it. He was my father's most trusted beta. He encouraged the pairing with my mother, praised their bond, all while secretly forging alliances with our enemies. The trap wasn't just physical. It was emotional. He kidnapped my mother and sent my father a message, knowing Alistair would come alone, trusting Silas to guard the pack in his absence. The pieces clicked into place for Elara, forming a picture far more sinister than Lyra's tale of a lovesick king. When my father arrived, Silas was there. Kaelen's voice dropped, thick with a century of hatred. He stood with our enemies and watched them cut my father down. His last act was to kill my mother himself, to prove his loyalty to his new allies. He didn't just want power. He wanted to destroy the very idea of a bond, to prove that such connections were a fool's game. The stakes of their own situation crashed down on Elara with terrifying clarity. Silas wasn't just a rival seeking a throne. He was a zealot, a nihilist who wanted to eradicate the one thing that had just saved Kaelen's soul. He wouldn't just use Elara as a pawn. He would want to destroy her to prove his philosophy right, to break Kaelen in the exact same way he had broken his father. Kaelen saw the understanding, the fear, in her eyes. He pulled her against him, his hold fiercely protective. "He will not have you," he growled, a vow of absolute certainty. "History will not repeat itself. I am not my father, and Silas has no idea what he has truly unleashed by forcing my hand." Chapter 15. A Queen's Resolve. News of the consummated bond spread through the Blackwood pack with the speed of a forest fire. There was no official announcement. There didn't need to be. The change was palpable. It radiated from their alpha like heat, a settled, possessive calm that had replaced his restless, tormented energy. And it was in the scent that now clung to the human, the unmistakable, undeniable scent of their king. Elara was no longer the human pet, the captive, the weakness. She was the Luna. When she and Kaelen finally emerged from his chambers late that afternoon, the reaction in the great hall was immediate and profound. As they descended the main staircase, Kaelen's hand resting possessively on the small of her back, a silence fell over the assembled warriors. Then, one by one, they lowered their heads and knelt, a gesture of deference not just to their alpha, but to her. All except for a small group standing near the hearth, Jax and Lyra among them. They bowed their heads in respect to their alpha, but their eyes, when they rose, were fixed on Elara with renewed, wary scrutiny. She had been claimed, but she had not been accepted. The test came that evening, during the communal meal. Kaelen had insisted she sit beside him at the head of the great table, a position reserved for the Pax Luna, a seat that had remained empty for 100 years. The whispers were back, a low hum of uncertainty. A large, grizzled warrior named Fun, known for his brute strength and traditionalist views, rose from his seat. "Alpha," he began, his voice booming in the hall. "We have pledged our lives to you. We will follow you into any battle, but you have bound yourself to a human." He said the word with open disdain. "She is fragile. She does not know our ways. How can she be our Luna? In the coming war, she will be a liability we cannot afford." A murmur of agreement rippled through a faction of the pack. Kaelen's hand tightened into a fist on the table, a low growl starting in his chest. The temperature in the room dropped. He was about to put the warrior in his place with the brutal, deadly force he was known for. But before he could, Elara stood. She placed a calming hand on Kaelen's arm, a silent request for him to stand down. He looked at her, shocked, but he subsided, his golden eyes blazing. Elara turned her gaze to Fun. She was not a warrior. She had no claws, no fangs, no supernatural strength, but she had her own weapon. "You are Fun," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent hall. Your family has guarded the eastern border for 5 generations. You believe in strength, tradition, and the sanctity of the pack above all else. Finn blinked, clearly taken aback that she knew who he was. You are right, she continued, her confidence growing. I am human. I am, by your standards, fragile. But you mistake the nature of strength. In my world, we have a saying. The strongest walls are not built of stone, but of knowledge. For the past week, I have not been idle. I have read your histories. She gestured toward the study. I have studied your laws. I know that the ancient pacts your ancestors made with the forest spirits are failing because the proper rituals have not been observed. I know that Silas's claim to territory is illegitimate under the old code, a fact that could turn the neutral river pacts against him if it were presented correctly. She let her words sink in. Your strength is in the claw and the fang. My strength is here. She tapped her temple. You see a fragile human. I see a pack that is about to go to war using the same tactics it has used for a century against an enemy who knows all of your moves. You see me as a liability, but a king who only has a hammer sees every problem as a nail. Your alpha now has a new tool in his arsenal, a new perspective. She looked around the hall, her gaze meeting the eyes of the stunned pack members. I will never be a warrior like you, but I will not be a weakness. I will be the mind to your muscle, the strategy to your strength. I am your Luna, and I will help you win this war. The hall was utterly silent. Finn stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, his argument dismantled not by force, but by irrefutable logic and an unnerving understanding of their world. Just as the tension was about to break, the great doors to the hall burst open. A scout, bloodied and exhausted, stumbled inside. Alpha, he gasped, collapsing to one knee. It's Silas. His army, they're on the move. They've crossed the Greyfong Pass. They march for Blackwood. A wave of snarls and shouts erupted in the hall. The time for debate was over. The war had arrived. Kaelen rose, his presence silencing the room instantly. He looked not at the scout, nor at his warriors, but at Elara, and in his eyes, she saw not just the fiery passion of a mate, but the deep, unwavering pride of a king who had just found his queen. Here are the final chapters of your story, bringing the tale of Kaelen and Elara to its conclusion. Chapter 16, The King's War Council. The scout's words hung in the air, a death knell to the brief moment of peace. The war was no longer a distant threat. It was a tide of violence rolling toward their home. Instantly, the hall transformed. Warriors rose, their faces hardening into grim masks of battle readiness. The low growls of anticipation were a rumbling promise of the bloodshed to come. Kaelen's presence dominated the chaos. He radiated an aura of absolute command, his focus narrowing to a lethal point. Jax, get a full report from him. Wounded, numbers, disposition of his forces. Ronan, secure the perimeter walls. I want every sentinel, every warrior, armed and in position within the hour. His commands were sharp, precise, and followed without question. He turned to Elara, his golden eyes locking with hers. For a moment, the hall and the impending war faded away, and it was just the two of them. He expected to see fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw a calm, burning intelligence that mirrored his own intensity. Stay in the study. It's the most fortified room in the lodge, he commanded, his voice softer, yet no less firm. No, she replied, her voice steady enough to cut through the din. You said it yourself, Kaelen. I am a new tool in your arsenal. The war is here. It's time to use me. Before he could argue, she turned to the massive, carved map that had been brought into the hall. The scouts said they came through Greyfong Pass. The histories say that pass is treacherous, prone to rock slides. It's a bottleneck. Silas would not risk his entire army there unless he was certain of his speed. He's counting on a swift, overwhelming assault before you can mount a full defense. Jax returned, his face grim. He's right, Alpha. The scout estimates Silas has 300 fighters, rogues, exiles, and the entire Greyfong pack he subjugated. They're moving fast. They'll be at our gates by dawn. A ripple of unease went through the warriors. Blackwood had numbers, but not that many. An assault on the walls would be costly. He wants to bleed us on the walls, Kaelen growled, his gaze fixed on the map. Then overwhelm us with sheer numbers. Then don't let him, Elara said, her finger tracing a faint line on the ancient map. Don't fight his battle. Fight yours. All eyes turned to her. Here, she said, pointing to a narrow, wooded valley that ran parallel to the main approach. The Whispering Valley. The old texts call it a place of bad spirits. Your people have avoided it for centuries, but the same texts say the spirits were an illusion created by your ancestors to hide a series of tactical choke points and ambush locations from their enemies. It's a kill box. He'll think it's an undefended flank. Lyra stepped forward, her expression skeptical. Those are children's stories. The valley is cursed. They are stories you've allowed yourselves to believe, Elara countered, her gaze unwavering. You've forgotten your own history, your own strengths. Silas is your enemy, but your greatest foe is your own rigid tradition. He's counting on you to defend the main gate. He's counting on you to be predictable. Kaelen stared at the map, then at Elara, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He saw it. He saw the brilliance of her plan. It was audacious, unexpected, and it used their enemy's knowledge of their traditions against him. He turned to his assembled warriors, his voice booming with renewed, savage confidence. We will not wait for the wolf at our door. We will meet him in the field. We will lure their main force toward the gate. But our deadliest warriors will be waiting in the Whispering Valley. We will let them think they're flanking us, and we will gut them from the inside out. He looked at Jax. Take 50 of our best. You will go with Luna. She will show you the ambush points from the old maps. He then looked at Elara, and the entire pack saw the shift. He was not protecting her by hiding her away. He was entrusting her with a vital part of his army. Lyra's eyes widened, a flicker of shock and dawning respect in their icy depths. Fun, the warrior who had challenged her, stared at Elara as if seeing her for the first time. She was not a liability. She was their secret weapon. Chapter 17. Before the dawn. The hours before the battle were a blur of focused activity. The lodge, once a home, had become a fortress preparing for a siege. The air was thick with the scent of sharpening steel, oiled leather, and the nervous energy of a pack on the verge of war. Elara worked tirelessly with Jax and his warriors in the study, poring over the ancient maps and scrolls. She pointed out terrain features, hidden ravines, and narrow passes described in the texts, her academic knowledge suddenly becoming a matter of life and death. Jax, initially wary, was quickly won over by her sharp intellect and calm demeanor. He saw what his alpha saw, a mind that could see the battlefield in a way no wolf could. As the moon reached its zenith, Kaelen found her alone on her balcony, staring out at the dark, silent forest where an army was marching toward them. The night was deceptively peaceful. He came up behind her, his large, warm body a solid presence against her back. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest and resting his chin on her head. For a long moment, they simply stood there, two souls finding a sliver of peace in the heart of the storm. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Terrified. She admitted in a whisper, "Not for me. For you. For all of them. I have never had anyone to be afraid for before," he confessed, his voice raw with an emotion he was still learning to name. "For a century, I have walked into battle with nothing to lose. Tonight, I walk into battle with everything to lose. It is the most terrifying and the most powerful feeling I have ever known." He turned her in his arms, his golden eyes intense in the moonlight. "You have changed me, Elara. You have taken the stone in my chest and made it beat again. You are my mate, my Luna, and the queen this pack did not know it needed. He reached to his own belt and unfastened a beautifully crafted dagger in a leather sheath. The handle was carved from dark wood, and the pommel was a single, unadorned piece of obsidian. It was simple, ancient, and radiated a sense of power. This was my mother's, he said, pressing it into her hands. She was no warrior, but she was a Luna. She told me a queen's weapon is not always for her enemies. Sometimes, it is to remind herself that she is not helpless. Elara's fingers curled around the hilt. It was a transfer of trust, of history, of his heart. Tears welled in her eyes, and she threw her arms around his neck, holding him tightly. Come back to me, she whispered fiercely. Always, he vowed, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that was both desperate and achingly tender. It was a kiss that held the fear of the coming dawn and the promise of 1,000 sunrises after. They moved to the bed, their lovemaking a stark contrast to the feral claiming under the full moon. This was a slow, deliberate act of two souls fortifying each other for what was to come. It was a silent conversation of touch and breath, a desperate imprinting of each other's bodies and spirits, a final, intimate moment of peace before the world descended into violence. As the first hint of gray light touched the horizon, he dressed for battle, strapping on pieces of hardened leather armor over his bare torso. He was no longer the lover. He was the king, the warrior, the personification of righteous fury. He gave her one last, lingering look from the doorway. Bar the door, he said, his voice the familiar growl of command, but his eyes held the tenderness of their night together. I have a traitor to kill. Then he was gone, his footsteps joining the heavy tread of his warriors as they marched out to meet their fate. Elara stood alone in the silence, her hand gripping the cool, solid weight of the Luna's dagger. Chapter 18. The Battle for Blackwood. The first sound was a single, piercing war horn from the valley floor, a mournful cry that signaled the arrival of Silas's army. From her vantage point in the study, which overlooked the main approach to the lodge, Elara could see them. It was a chaotic, snarling sea of fur and steel, a motley force of rogues and exiles moving with a rabid hunger. At their head rode Silas, a large, silver-furred shifter whose arrogance was visible even from a distance. As planned, a small contingent of Blackwood warriors met them at the outer defenses, a feigned show of force designed to draw the bulk of Silas's army forward. The battle began with a deafening roar as the two forces clashed. It was a brutal, savage ballet of claws and blades. Elara's heart pounded in her chest. She could not see Kaelen, but she could feel him through the bond. A raging inferno of controlled fury, a beacon of strength in the chaos. Then she saw the second part of Silas's plan unfold. A smaller, elite group of about 20 shifters broke from the main force, melting into the woods on the western flank, heading directly for the Whispering Valley. They were walking into the trap. The wait was agonizing. Elara paced the study, her knuckles white where she gripped her mother-in-law's dagger. Then a new series of howls erupted from the valley, the unmistakable, disciplined battle cries of the Blackwood Sentinels. Jax's attack had begun. The effect on Silas's army was immediate. Their flank, which they thought was secure, had become a meat grinder. Confusion turned to panic as their elite force was decimated. Silas, enraged, tried to rally his troops, but the psychological blow was devastating. It was then that Kaelen made his move. He appeared as if from nowhere, shifting mid-charge into his massive, black wolf form. He was a force of nature, a shadow of death that carved a bloody path through the enemy's center. He moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, his eyes fixed on one target, Silas. The battle turned into a rout. Silas's army, broken and flanked, began to flee. But Silas himself did not run. He met Kaelen's charge, shifting into his own powerful, silver wolf form. The two alphas, the king and the traitor, clashed in the center of the battlefield in a primal, earth-shaking duel. But Silas was a creature of cunning and deceit. The duel was a distraction. Elara felt a sudden, cold spike of fear through the bond. A danger that wasn't directed at Kaelen. A loud crash from downstairs echoed through the lodge. Her blood ran cold. They were inside. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. The study door, made of reinforced oak, splintered and burst inward. 3 rogue shifters, their eyes burning with red malice, stalked into the room. They had bypassed the main defenses, scaling the rock face at the rear of the lodge, just as the rogue had tried to do on that first night. They had come for the weakness. They had come for her. The lead rogue grinned, his teeth yellowed and sharp. "The Alpha is busy," he sneered. He left his little human all alone. Elara's mind raced. There was no escape. Her back was to the wall. The 3 shifters advancing on her slowly, savoring her fear. She held the Luna's dagger in a trembling hand, the blade looking pitifully small against their hulking forms. She was the strategist, the historian, not the fighter. But Kaelen's words echoed in her mind. A queen's weapon is not always for her enemies. Sometimes, it is to remind herself that she is not helpless. Her fear did not vanish, but a cold, hard resolve settled over it. She would not be the screaming victim in this story. She would not be the weakness that broke the king. If she was going to die, she would die as a Luna of the Blackwood pack. She tightened her grip on the dagger, angled her body, and prepared to fight. Chapter 19. The King and the Traitor. The lead rogue lunged. He was fast, but Elara's mind was faster. Fueled by adrenaline and the countless battle accounts she had read, she didn't try to meet his attack head-on. She dropped, sweeping her leg out in a desperate, clumsy move. It was just enough to disrupt his balance. As he stumbled, she scrambled backward, putting a heavy oak desk between herself and the attackers. "Clever little thing," the second rogue growled, circling the desk. "It won't save you." Outside, the duel between Kaelen and Silas raged. Elara could feel Kaelen's attention being torn, his fury mixed with a spike of pure terror that was not his own. It was hers, bleeding through the bond. He knew she was in danger. "Hurry," she prayed, her eyes darting around the room, searching for anything that could be a weapon. Her gaze landed on a tall, heavy iron candelabra standing by the fireplace. The first rogue righted himself and vaulted over the desk. Elara shoved a stack of heavy, leather-bound books into his path, causing him to trip again. She used the precious second to dart to the fireplace, grabbing the heavy candelabra with both hands. It was unwieldy but solid. The 3 shifters cornered her, their snarls echoing in the stone chamber. "No more games, human," the leader snarled. He lunged again, and this time she was ready. She swung the heavy iron stand with all her might, the momentum carrying it in a wide arc. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crack. He went down in a heap, stunned. The other 2, enraged, charged at once. She was out of time. Suddenly, a gray blur shot through the shattered doorway. It was Lyra. The elder she-wolf moved with the lethal grace of a seasoned warrior, her eyes chips of ice. She slammed into one of the rogues, her claws and fangs a whirlwind of righteous fury. She was not just protecting a human. She was defending her Luna. The momentary distraction was all Kaelen needed. A black hurricane of rage exploded into the room. Kaelen, back in his human form but with his eyes still blazing with the wolf's fire, took in the scene in an instant. Elara cornered but defiant. Lyra, fighting like a demon, and the rogue advancing on his mate. With a roar that was pure, unadulterated fury, he crossed the room in a blur. He didn't just fight the rogue. He annihilated him. It was over in a second of brutal, final violence. A piercing howl of rage and frustration echoed from the battlefield below. Silas. His plan had failed. Kaelen turned to Elara, his chest heaving, his body splattered with blood. He scanned her for injuries, his golden eyes wild with fear and relief. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. "No," she breathed, her body trembling. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. "Mine," he growled the word of prayer. But it wasn't over. Silas, his silver fur matted with blood, appeared in the doorway. He held a wicked-looking blade, and his eyes were fixed on them with a mad, nihilistic glee. "Just like your father," he hissed at Kaelen, his voice dripping with venom. "So easily distracted by a worthless female. Now you get to watch this one die too." He lunged, not at Kaelen but at Elara. Kaelen moved to intercept him, but Silas was fast. He was going to reach her. "Kaelen!" Elara screamed, not in fear, but as a warning. She threw the heavy candelabra at Silas's legs. It was a weak, desperate throw, but it was enough. Silas stumbled, his lunge diverted for a fraction of a second. It was the opening Kaelen needed. He didn't meet Silas with blind rage as his father had. He moved with the cold, deadly precision of a king. He sidestepped the wild swing of the blade, his hand catching Silas's wrist in a grip of iron. With a sickening crack, he broke the traitor's arm. Silas screamed, dropping the blade. Kaelen looked down at the shifter who had haunted his past for a century. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold finality. "My father ruled with his heart," Kaelen said, his voice deadly calm. "I rule with my mate beside me. You failed to learn the difference." With a final, swift movement, he ended the life and the legacy of the traitor who had broken his family. The battle was over. The past was finally laid to rest. Chapter 20. The dawn of a new era. The silence that followed the battle was more profound than the noise had been. The Blackwood pack, bruised and bloodied, was victorious. The sun began to rise, its gentle rays illuminating a scene of devastation, but also of survival. In the aftermath, Elara saw the final threads of her acceptance being woven into the fabric of the pack. Warriors she had never spoken to nodded to her with a new, profound respect. Fun, the warrior who had doubted her, personally brought her a cup of water. His head bowed. "You were right, Luna," he said, his voice filled with awe. "Strength is more than claws." Her most meaningful affirmation came from Lyra. The old she-wolf approached her as she was helping to tend to the wounded. Her face grim, but her icy eyes thawed by respect. "Alistair's queen had a good heart," Lyra said quietly. "But you have a spine of steel. The Alpha has chosen well. The pack is safe with you." It was the highest praise the elder could give, an absolution and a blessing all in one. Later, after the grim work of cleaning the battlefield was done, Kaelen found her. He led her by the hand, away from the lodge, away from the pack, up the winding path to Blackwood Ridge. It was the same precipice where he had stood as a lonely, ruthless king in the beginning, surveying his domain. The sun was now fully risen, bathing the vast forest in a warm, golden light. The air was clean, washed by the storm, and smelled of pine and damp earth. He stood beside her, his arm wrapped securely around her waist, their bodies pressed together. The bond between them was a calm, deep ocean, vast and unshakable. "I used to come up here to remind myself of what I was fighting for," he said, his voice a low, peaceful rumble. Land, power, survival. It all felt so hollow. "And now?" she asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. He looked down at her, and the love in his eyes was so powerful it took her breath away. "Now I know I was only ever fighting to keep this kingdom safe, until you arrived. This land isn't just territory, Elara. It's our home. The pack isn't just an army. They are our family." He had been the ruthless Alpha, a creature of shadow and fear, defined by his isolation. But with her, he had become more. He was Kaelen, her human mate, a king made whole not by power, but by love. She, in turn, had been a lonely academic, a woman running from a life of quiet disappointment. Here, in this wild, impossible world, she had found her strength, her purpose, her home. Imagine a creature so powerful, so dominant, that fear is its shadow, she murmured, echoing the hook of a story she once thought was just folklore. Now imagine that same creature, brought to his knees not by an enemy, but by love. He finished for her, his lips finding hers in a soft, lingering kiss. They stood together on the ridge, the king and his Luna, the alpha and his mate. He was no less powerful, no less dominant, but the fear his shadow cast was gone, burned away by the light she had brought into his world. Below them, a new day was dawning, and for the first time in a century, the future of the Blackwood Pack looked brighter than the rising sun.